Hey everybody, Jason here. Today we are going to be talking about fair housing fundamentals. So in my opinion, this is the kind of foundation to everything else that we have going on in the property management cycle. This kind of sets the groundwork for everything else that we do in terms of marketing and screening and leasing and the move-ins and resident relations. All of the systems and the forms and everything else we do kind of has our basis in fair housing, so that it helps keep us out of trouble, discrimination trouble, liability trouble, things along those lines. So that's why I felt it was important to kind of cover this first in regards to the property management cycle and the rest of this course. So we're going to jump right in here and check out fair housing, what it has in store for us. So what is fair housing? Now, fair housing has its roots in the Civil Rights Act. Actually, it does have its roots in the Civil Rights Act. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. It's going to kind of explain a little bit of the history of it so you can kind of see how it's developed over the years. But really more than anything, it is designed to protect people from discrimination in housing. That is its purpose. That is its mission. There are a lot of different levels in terms of places it could be applied. So there's definitely federal fair housing laws. There's state fair housing laws, and then you can have them at the county and the city level as well. Now, generally speaking, as we go through this, one thing to keep in mind that it is a good idea that we follow the most restrictive set of rules in the area that we are affected by. So if a city, for example, has 3 more protected classes than the federal, well, follow those rules. And that should keep you out of trouble, because again, the idea here is that as you go into different areas, different things have been put into place to protect and deal with certain situations in terms of discrimination based on what they've experienced in that area, ideally. So just follow the most restrictive set of rules and you should be good to go there. This is just going to be a part of being a landlord. If you decide to continue your journey as a landlord, or if you've gotten into this, whether you think some of this stuff is fair, not fair, right, wrong, it really doesn't matter. It's part of it. It's what we have to do. A lot of it is very legitimate. There are still definitely issues that require fair housing type oversight and rules and regulations and laws these days. Some of this stuff can be abused. Some of this stuff does go over the top, sure, just like anything else. But overall, there's a reason these things are in place, and it has been a force for good when you take a look at the bigger picture of things. The next thing I want to talk about is make sure to stay up to date with the changes. Within the multifamily industry, they really want to see everybody have annual training, and I think that's a good idea for us as landlords as well, because things change. Things are always being updated. There's I took I was kind of lapsed myself, and I kind of re-upped on my fair housing training here recently, and even then a couple things have changed since the last time I've taken it. Some new laws and stuff with the new administration, or new executive orders actually, that have kind of updated some of the stuff that I wasn't aware of. So I'm glad I did that, and I would recommend that you do at least an annual training somewhere to make sure you are up to date with all of your laws and regulations. Okay, so again, why are we covering the fair housing first? Like I explained, it's kind of the foundational component of managing property, of being a landlord. It does affect how we structure our processes, the way we set up our forms, the way we work with people, the things that we do, the way that we operate. If a lot of this stuff, if we built it into our fundamental, our structural processes, then it keeps us out of a lot of trouble later on. Trouble that, maybe we weren't aware of, or trouble that we're not even meaning to get into. There's no intention behind a lot of this stuff, but it does shield us from those unintentional acts just by putting proper processes and policies and procedures into place, and then just following them. So again, that's why I say it's foundational. It's why I want to cover it first, because it does, as you'll see, it does affect pretty much every aspect of the property management cycle and running your business. Okay, so why is knowledge of fair housing important? Again, there's a lot of areas that we can get caught up here. A lot of things change. There are a lot of tenant advocacy groups popping up out there. There are tenants that are becoming more, I don't want to say educated, but more aware of this stuff, and some of them use these things to snag landlords in some cases, and sometimes it's just simply for staying in the home a little bit longer without paying rent, or sometimes it's about filing complaints and seeing if they can get some money out of the landlord or whatever else. But once again, if we structure this stuff right, we're going to be in pretty good shape, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing this right now, is so we can kind of move forward and set this up the right way, just to kind of keep you out of this. But again, I want you to be aware, because if you're aware, you're more likely to steer clear of some of these traps that are kind of out there and some of the things that we have to deal with. Another reason, the investigation process is not pleasant at all. You have people investigating this, and a lot of times you are automatically the bad guy, and you get treated as such, and there is kind of an invasion of privacy almost. You have to give up things, you have to produce documents, you have to explain yourself in a lot of areas where context and a lot of times is no longer available. I mean, because sometimes these complaints are 6 months down, 8 months down the road, and depending on how well we keep records and things along those lines, it's hard to kind of frame this in such a way that puts it in a proper context. So it's just not a pleasant deal. It's frustrating, it's stressful. There are potential financial impacts to this, which is stressful. So again, just overall, it's not pleasant. It can be expensive, especially if you have to get an attorney involved to defend yourself against, even if it's an open shut case, and this goes into the federal court or a civil suit or whatever else, is expensive along that lines. If you do get found, kind of guilty, for lack of better words, or HUD, issues they say that you've done some discriminatory practices. There's fines involved, punitive damages. I don't think there's a limit on them these days. Or if there ever has been. I guess I should rather say, last I knew, there were no caps to punitive damages. So, if you are found guilty of discrimination and they sue you civilly, I mean, it can get pretty ugly depending on what it is, how serious it is. So again, very expensive. And then, like I mentioned before, is a lot of this stuff is easily avoided just by having the proper setup. And again, that's what we want to make sure to have. So, okay, so I've been a multifamily, so I've owned a property management company for single family and multifamily homes. I've owned multifamily properties and single family. I've worked for multifamily companies, larger ones. I think the most I've had under my supervision is 17,000 units. Over 6 states. So the point being is that I've been exposed to a lot of different situations, and have had to deal with and have had to work through a lot of fair housing situations, more so than I would say your typical landlord who just has a single family home and really isn't as much of a target for some of these things as these larger companies are. So I just want to kind of talk about some of those things real quick. I think my very first one is the one that stuck with me the most, is the Human Rights Commission. It was a city office, and they were, they're pretty much an investigation type wing for housing complaints, discrimination complaints, things along those lines. There was a state one as well, like this one. There's the state of Kansas, you see on here, state of Arizona. They have their own deals, but this was a city-level, city-based organization, and taxpayer funded, grant funded. things along those lines. So the very first discrimination type complaint that I had was we were about a year into our property management company, and there was a lady who we were in the process of evicting because she stopped paying rent. We couldn't get in touch with her. I don't even remember if she broke commitments, but whatever the case, we're moving into the eviction process. And then she filed a complaint with this Human Rights Commission saying that we discriminated against her based on color of her skin, if I remember correctly, and that some of the ways that this has happened, we refused to do maintenance for her and things along those lines. So we had an investigator come in, and they basically said, hey, listen, this is what's going on, and we want access to all of your records. Now, the place where she lived at was a fourplex, and I remember the owner's name and everything, but it was one owner. She owned 4 units, and this investigator said, we want access to all of your owner files, to all your tenant files. We need to call people and basically find out if they think you're discriminated against them too. And if you don't do that, we're going to subpoena the records, and that's going to look bad, and it's just not a good situation. So we're going to come in and you give us what we want. And so we're about a year in or so to our management company, and we're like, okay, well, let's comply. We have all of our documentations. We have everything. I mean, me and my business partner both worked for larger management companies in the past, so we had our processes in place, especially for a newer company, and we had everything lined up. So we're like, not a big deal. Go on, do what you got to do. We have our stuff. And so she came in, and a couple other people, and really they treated us, in my opinion, pretty badly. It was like we were guilty already. We were being cooperative. We didn't give them any grief. And they came in, they made copies of owner files and contact information and tenant files, and then they left. A couple weeks later, we got a call from some of those tenants, some of them concerned because they said that somebody was calling from the Human Rights Commission saying that there's been some accusations of discrimination and that there's a potential class action lawsuit, and then framed it that way, and then started asking them, how's your experience been with this company and Jason and my business partner, and just really fishing for stuff. And we didn't manage a ton of properties at the time, probably less than 100 units. We knew most of our tenants pretty well, actually. We were we had good relationships with our owners, and so we started getting a lot of this feedback because they were concerned about it. And so we called down there, and they basically told us to mind our own business. This is part of the investigation process. Tried to get a hold of the supervisor, wouldn't call us back. So we were like, okay. Thought about getting an attorney, but we said, well, they should have everything they need. Let's let this play out. 6 months later, we finally get in front of this board, this commission, and there's like 4, 5, 6 people, to where this investigator, basically said that we should be found guilty of discrimination. This is exactly why. And then we get up there and we line out everything, all of our documentation and everything else, and then also brought up the fact that, this investigator was calling around, fishing for this stuff and trying to frame it in such a way that we had done something wrong. And it was pretty quick. I mean, they shut the case down pretty quick, and actually within about 6 months, that other investigator, I don't know if there's other issues, but she's no longer with the department. Within a year of that actual little department had closed down. So I think that I almost feel like that they were fishing for situations to show that they can have results, because I don't think there was a lot going on. And for us, it was frustrating because it really was a pretty open and shut case. She said we weren't doing maintenance for, but we had records of every maintenance call that came in. Everything was taken care of typically within 24 hours. They had follow-up calls documented, making sure everything was good. And it was a pretty open and shut case that this person just didn't want to pay rent, but is what it is. I'll talk about that. That one's probably my longest story, only because it was the first one and probably the one that stuck with me the most. But we did deal with some other situations. State of Kansas, a lot more professional, worked a lot more the way it was supposed to. Had an investigator come in, tell us what was going on. We presented them with the records or whatever. They reviewed everything. They did some investigative stuff too, but it was done within a month. They went through everything, very professional. They didn't come at us like we were the bad guys out of the gate. Just, hey, this has been filed. We need to investigate and do our job. What's your side of the story? So that was a much better experience, but still never a pleasant deal. I have dealt with them in the state of Arizona, dealt with them on a Houston lawsuit that really, I kind of came in at the back end. It had been something been going on for a year and a half against the owner and the management company when I assumed my role at that particular position. And that one was in court. It saw some court time, and at that point it was a year and a half, 2 years of ongoing where we had legal expenses and everything else. So I know that one ran up the costs on the pocketbook as well. And then I've had to deal with some tenant advocacy groups out there, and their primary function is to go out there and find cases of discrimination and helping tenants is what their mission is. But it always seems like, they had their own testers, and they were more than happy to take complaints, and then they would send their testers out and do their own investigation and try to catch people up in things. And again, it's just, if it takes away, in my opinion, of the real issues that are out there and the things that are happening, takes energy away from that, because there are very legitimate things happening out there. So when they're out there trying to trip people up and playing the gotcha game, I just don't think it serves the overall purpose. And I know I've had bad experiences with tenant advocacy groups, and I know not all of them are negative type organizations. Are probably not all like that. Unfortunately, those are just the experiences I've had with them. Okay, so let's just touch base a little bit here on kind of the historical part of this. And I know you're not here for a history lesson, but I think it's important to know kind of how this has progressed over the years. So again, like I said, this stems out of the Civil Rights Act, but as a part of that, it became known as not the Civil Rights, but a part of the Civil Rights Act dealing with the housing, discrimination in housing, is also known as the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The kind of main mission statement of it is, and what it did was it prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, the rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, and national origin. Then in 1972, they kind of readdressed it some more, and they added in some extra provisions, the equal opportunity housing poster, and things that you're supposed to use and demonstrate and display. It's kind of a small expansion, but an expansion. Again, expanded in 1974 to include sex as part of protected classes. The problem up to this point with the Fair Housing Act is that it really had no teeth. The penalties were not very steep, so it didn't really change much in terms of the behaviors of the organizations and landlords that were causing problems. It didn't really do much to stem that, because there wasn't really a whole bunch in terms of penalties if you were found kind of in violation of that. Okay, so then we get to 1988, and this is where they kind of jump in and remedy some of that stuff. They expanded it and added physical and mental handicap. They added familial status, which we'll dive into a little bit more. But I think the most impactful part of this is that they really upped those penalties for the violations, and then they added the punitive damages as well. And again, I don't think there's ever been a cap on the punitive damages, and definitely not since the last I heard. I think that was still open. So, even if a fine from HUD was $15,000 and they take you to civil court and sue you and win, it can be $100, $150, $200,000, whatever, the damages or whatever the situation was. There was just no cap to that. So that's really the financially scary side of that. We don't want to get hit with HUD and those penalties. We don't want to be on their radar by any means, but a $200,000 lawsuit can put some people out of business completely. Okay, so then it expanded again with the HOPA, the Housing for Older Persons Act of 1995. And this is where they started doing some carve-outs really in housing that related to senior citizens. And so they decided somewhere along the lines, for some reasons, that they needed to create some communities that you could discriminate in on age. And not in a negative way. Discrimination doesn't necessarily mean negative. It's just the separation of and treating something different based on a certain characteristic, and this one is age. So what kind of came out of that are 55 and older communities and 62 and older communities. Now the 55 and older communities, they both have requirements, but the 55 and older, if I remember correctly, it's 80% of the community has to be 55 and older, and at least one person in the home has to be 55 and older. So it doesn't necessarily exclude children or people under 55, but you have to have a certain percentage of people in that community that are 55 and older. And of course, there's when you step into these types of programs and so forth, there's auditing components and things along those lines that that come into place as well, so that the proper organizations can ensure that you're following that criteria. Now the 62 and older communities are a lot more restrictive. I think some of the HUD-based ones, and there's all kinds of programs out there, so each one's going to differ, and there's going to be financing programs and all kinds of stuff. But in general, the 62 and older communities, everybody is supposed to be 62 years and older. I think there's a cutout that if you're disabled, you can be 55 and older, and there's some exceptions here and there depending on the type of community it is. But generally speaking, 62 and older, everybody there is going to be 62 and older. Now again, this was really just to provide more of a space where senior citizens can go and they can be in a community and not have to deal with some of the stuff that may be coming out of regular apartment communities, in more of a retirement type setting for people who have reached a certain age, a little more peaceful living. Okay, another component, expansion, is the Service Members Civil Relief Act of 2003. Now this is also known as the Soldiers and Sailors Act, and really this isn't a super complicated deal. It is in place to protect active duty military, deal with certain financial situations. It's not just specifically related to housing. It also deals with car leases and some other things as well. But for our situation, what we're talking about today with housing and fair housing and being a landlord, we'll stick to that. So what this does is it says basically if you're an active duty member of the military and you get orders, permanent orders, change of station, or you are going on a deployment that's going to last more than 90 days and you need to break your lease agreement, then you can break your lease agreement without penalty. Now, there are a couple components to that. You have to give a 30-day notice. You know, you're still responsible for damages. You're still responsible for that rent for that 30 days. It's just you have to go out the right way, or you still face the same type of issues that a regular tenant would if they don't take care of the obligations. But this keeps them from being responsible for the rest of the lease. So if you have a year lease and they're 3 months in and they get a permanent change of station or orders for a permanent change, deployment, whatever, they give you the notice and you let them out of their lease and you get it ready and you re-rent. So be aware of that if you rent to military. Now, one of the things that we were dealing with for a while were people would come in and be like, I just joined the military, whatever branch, I'm going to boot camp, you have to let me out of your lease. And that is not exactly the way that it works. Boot camp and the tech school, they're not actually active duty. Now, having said that, there's a good chance that there will be a permanent change of station or there will be a deployment unless you're maybe Reserve or National Guard. But until that time comes, they really can't fall back in the Soldiers and Sailors Act. But, you know, to each their own. If you feel like, okay, well, that's fine. If they want to go, let's just get them out, make it do the right way, because they're going to go one way or the other is what it sounds like at that point. Because if they're trying to use that to get out of the lease, well, maybe make a clean break, get it re-rented. I don't know. That's a personal choice. But if you want to hold them to that lease, you can, because the Soldiers and Sailors Act doesn't quite protect under that situation. Now, if you, let me see. Okay, let me jump back here. One more thing on that. If you feel like there is some, because there has been some cases of like abuse of this, just like I said with the boot camp scenario. But if you feel like that maybe you are getting a fake set of orders, or you're supposed to give a 30-day notice. They're supposed to give you a copy of their orders, their deployment or whatever else. But if you are unsure about that, you do have the right to check in on that. You can call their, I think it's the administration section of the base or whatever, and you can verify those and make sure those orders are actually legitimate. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, once they are, don't give them a hard time. You know, they're serving their nation. Just make sure they go out the right way, get them their money back, deposit back, as long as they take care of everything and just move on. But also know that when you lease to active duty military, that is definitely a potential. Okay, so the federal fair housing protected classes. These are the standard ones. Now, this is at the federal level. As we go down the line with the state and the county and the city, when I was talking about things getting more restrictive, usually what ends up happening, if something happens, is they add additional protected classes. But these are the classic 7 here. So we have disability, race, sex, color, national origin, religion, and family status. So basically, you cannot deny housing to somebody based on one of these classes. So you can't say single mother of a child that's under 18, I don't want them to live upstairs because it's going to disturb the neighbor. Or I don't want them to live in this building because they are Asian of descent and the people of Asian descent live over in this building. Things along those lines. If you are denying housing, shuffling housing, doing those types of things based on a protected class, then ultimately you would be found guilty of discrimination and you would start to go down that path. Okay, so like I said, there are additional protected classes here, and this is when you start getting your states, your counties, your cities. The important thing here is to know your laws. There's going to be some resources here that will give you links to all the landlord-tenant laws for every state. And in a lot of cases, some of those links have city-specific things as well. Be sure to check those out. It's important because, again, if you know what you're dealing with, then you could put in processes and policies on the front end to where you just avoid it altogether. Most of the stuff is 100% avoidable. Even if somebody makes an accusation, if you're prepared ahead of time and you have the stuff built into your process, it's extremely difficult for them to get very far with it. But here's some of the different protected classes that you can see as you start, getting down to more of the county, city, state, county, city level. And it really just kind of depends on where you're at and what you'll see with some of these. So you got some your regular ones, your disability, sex, age. Now some of the ones that have been popping up here, sexual orientation. Now, one of the things that was new for me was the Biden administration, depending on when you're watching this video. Obviously, Joe Biden's the president right now. The Biden administration put in an executive order that expanded the sexual orientation to also include, the gender identity and, all of that's going on right now, which is fine. Apparently, it's needed somewhere, but that's one of the things that's a great example of how things change. I just wasn't aware of it. And who knows what'll change in another year. But again, just stay up on your training on that. Conviction record. I'm starting to hear in some of the landlord groups that I'm in that, like in certain cities and states, that tenants are starting to be successful with going to court and asking that the judge or the court strike the eviction from being visible from the record because it will impact their ability to find housing in the future. And so far it's taken attorneys to do this for them, but they're starting to win these cases, and those things are starting to happen to where evictions aren't even showing up anymore, even if they were evicted, even if there was damages, even if there was money owed. So be aware of that. That's, they start in certain areas, but those types of provisions start to expand into others. So, watch out for that. It is an issue. But again, income is another one. Like in some areas, income is a protected class. So if they have a Section 8 voucher, you cannot not take it because that's a protected class. So in some areas, if you're a landlord, whether you want to or not, you have to work with the Section 8 program. Okay. Oh, here's those resources I was talking about. I'll leave some links down there. There's actually a couple more than this, but these are cool because you can go in, you can click on the state, and it's not only the landlord tenant laws, but a lot of times they get into state specific stuff. There's some other things like they pull out some things that are common occurrences, like what do you do with abandoned property, things along this line. So this is Avail, this is apartments.com, this is Turbo Tenant. I'm gonna think I have Nolo in there, and Zillow has another good one, and all of them they all have landlord tenant law stuff. They all link to the actual states, and they all link to landlord tenant laws for those states, but each one has a little different spin and some different information. So just peruse on your state. I mean, click your state on these, check them out, and you never know what you don't know. So great resources. I use them all the time, just if nothing else, to freshen up and make sure that I'm remembering things correctly. Because again, when you work in multiple states, some of this stuff bleeds together and you can't remember what is applicable and where. Okay, so where do fair housing laws apply? Who do they affect? Where they apply. So first off, any type of housing. So houses, apartments, mobile homes. A lot of the states actually have their own like mobile home landlord tenant act that has some specific things that deal with things that mobile home parks deal with. Condos, retirement homes, homeowners associations, non-profit shelters, and housing. Some motels have to deal with this as well, especially if you are an extended stay hotel, because after a certain period of time is considered, again, housing, longer term housing. It's not just transitional. Who is required to comply? So property owners, absolutely. Property managers are subject. Maintenance staff for apartment communities, for sure. Vendors, I have seen stuff that has affected vendors, and they've, certain vendors. I've seen vendors. I've worked with vendors who have done some things that they shouldn't have done, wouldn't change their ways, and we had to stop working with them. I've never seen anyone go after a vendor, but they absolutely could if they wanted to. So it affects vendors. And vendors, I mean carpet cleaning, cleaners, plumbers, anything along those lines. Again, the HOAs, the HOA staffs, builders and architects, especially in the way that they have to make sure the buildings comply with building codes that are based around ADA and fair housing type issues. Real estate agents, absolutely, as part of getting licensed, both my real estate license and my broker's license, had to have fair housing training in those. Management companies, obviously, and probably more so than anybody else, because they have to deal with so many different, types of housing, different owners, and, they have to keep their policies really dialed in and consistent across the board, which I know bugs some owners, but there's a reason that, it's hard for them to be as flexible as some owners would like them to be. Lenders and insurers are also subject, and this is why if a insurance company, and we'll get into this later, but if an insurance company, cancels your policy because you have to take an emotional support animal that happens to be a banned on their banned list, their vicious breed list, like a pit bull, maybe in some cases, since we like to pick on pit bulls. So there you go. I mean, there are ESA pit bulls, and if an insurance company cancels your policy and refuses to give you any other options, they're subject to the FHA, and you as a landlord can actually file a complaint against them as well for breaching the Fair Housing Act in that scenario. So keep that in mind. Insurance companies are subject to it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the just common definitions of fair housing, the Fair Housing Act. Discrimination, of course, is the big one, and discrimination is basically the textbook definition is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people based on a protected class. So again, there's a lot of different ways to discriminate. You can discriminate against me as a white male. I am not a protected class. You can literally say, sorry, I don't want you to live here because you are a white male and we don't accept white males here, and that's perfectly okay. I am not a protected class. Now, if I happen to be a gay white male, different story. If I happen to have a child that was under 18 and I was a single father, different story, familial status. But there is legal discrimination. But discrimination, what we're talking about are, again, those protected classes, the big seven, and then the additional ones. Any discrimination in housing based on a class is protected under the Fair Housing Act, and then ADA, we touch on that as well. So one of the things that is common is steering. Now, steering is basically the example I used earlier was saying, okay, you at an apartment community, for example, let's say that an Asian family comes and wants to live at your community, but you only show them a building, available units that have other Asian families living in them because you think they would feel more comfortable there. That's steering. That's moving them based on a protected class and not showing them everything that's available and trying to push them in a certain direction. So that's a good example of steering. Redlining. This is more kind of on the mortgage side of things. We don't deal a whole bunch in this, but it was a big deal. And redlining, literally from, I was when this was popular, as before I was born, but from what I hear, they would literally have maps laid out and companies would line out neighborhoods with a certain percentage of, ethnic backgrounds or high ethnic populations, and then hence the term redlining, because they would block out the areas they didn't want to lend to. So I don't really hear much about stuff like that happening these days, but it was a big problem for a long time. Another one was block busting. And this is basically going to a homeowner and saying, let's just say you go to, a little old white grandma, and you say, in your real estate, and you say, hey, listen, you should really consider selling because we are starting to get a lot of, pick your race. Let's say let's just say Asians. We're getting a lot of people with Asian descent moving in a neighborhood, and that's going to drop the property value of your neighborhood. You should sell now. That is a great example of what block busting is convincing that homeowner to sell based that, there's going to be an effect on value because neighborhood, people of a protected class are moving into a neighborhood. Disparate impact. This is any policy that affects a group of people more than it does another. So one great example of this, and this has actually changed in the way that we can screen, in a way that our screening criteria talks about criminal history, is like the criminal background side of it. And what the argument was with HUD was that since a higher proportion of African American men are in prison, that a policy of saying no felonies in the last 10 years affects them more than it does people of another race. And so therefore there's a disparate impact, there's discrimination, you can no longer have those policies in place. Now you can have no criminal background stuff in place, and we talk about that a lot more in our screening for success module, but you have to be a little more specific with it. You can't be so general, and again, we get into that more when we talk about our screening criteria. And then of course the Fair Housing Act itself, like we said before, it is designed to protect people from discrimination in the rental, sale, or of a home, or financing and construction. Okay, so now on that note, the discrimination in the rental or sale of a home, examples of this are, again, refusal to rent a home. They show up to look at a home, you notice they're of Asian descent, and you're like, I don't rent to people of Asian descent, I'm sorry. That's discrimination, obviously. Or, pick your protected class. I don't rent to people that have a disability. I don't rent to single mothers that have kids, or anybody that has kids. Making the home unavailable. Like, so let's just say they show up, and you're not saying that you don't rent to that protected class, but you're like, oh, well, it's no longer available. We don't have it anymore. And then 2 days later, they see it still on the market, and, and they show back up, and then you're still showing it, making home unavailable. Having a different set of agreement or rules for somebody. So having a different lease that has different rules that are more restrictive against the person of that protected class is a great example of that. And then also providing different facilities or services. So, I can't even think of any present day examples, but taking it back, just think of the white only restrooms or drinking fountains, all the pictures you see. And I mean, again, nothing I've personally ever seen or experienced myself, but I think that would be a great example of different services based on a protected class. And I think that was very prevalent. Like maybe you can't use a clubhouse if you are of a certain race, or a sexual orientation, or whatever today's deals are. Again, I don't hear a whole bunch about those types of situations these days, just because apartment communities are very good at making sure that they set this up the right way. Not that it doesn't happen, it does. It's just not as common as it once was. Couple other examples here. Again, falsely denying that housing is available rent. I think we hit that one. Block busting, the sale of that home. That's what we were talking about, where they were saying, hey, you have a group of people coming in, it's going to lower your value, you need to sell and get out now while you still can. We hit on that in the definitions. And then again, denying anyone access to or membership. So maybe it's a homeowners association that says people with children aren't allowed to use the pool, we're not going to give you a key fob. Something along those lines. Some sort of denial of access to facilities that other people get and you don't, because you fall under a protected class. Okay, discrimination in financing. We'll touch on this real quick. Again, this isn't our main focus, but it's good to know. Again, refusal to make a mortgage. We had that redlining example, different terms or conditions on the loan based on a protected class. The discrimination in the appraisal of a property. So the going in and maybe using a specific appraiser that is going to come in extremely low, so you don't have to rent to a certain person, things along those lines. There's a reason why banks and mortgage and lending institutions now have a pool of appraisers, and they randomly, basically randomly throw out there, this is what it is, and it's just this random order that the next appraiser comes up. So it kind of eliminates this possibility from happening, that manipulation. And then setting different terms and conditions for purchasing a loan. So for example, if there's an assumption clause in a loan, and a white person is able to come in and assume that loan, but you have something in there basically saying that and this is extreme, but if you're not a white person, you can't assume that loan. It's, again, extreme example, but it wasn't always an extreme example. So those things have happened. That's why these things are in place. Okay, so I think this is going to be a good place for us to wrap up. Again, hopefully there's some good information in this section here. When we come back, for next week, we're going to start talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications. This is where our ESAs come in, assistance animals, things along those lines, the reasonable accommodation request forms, how to do all of that stuff. So we'll wrap it up here for now. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you next time. Again, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Hit us up in our Q&A session that we're going to have, and that we have every week. And then, that's it. We will see you next time. Thanks again.